Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll give you an idea about the mobilization investment in general, then we'll discuss just a few slides about Qatar, what we are doing in order to invest in low carbon and climate resilience. What is low carbon climate resilience infrastructure? The development of LCR infrastructure system, power, road, rail, water, building, etc. substantially reduce global GHG emission while making this system more adaptable to extreme weather conditions. The need to invest in infrastructure that is both carbon and climate resilience comes at a time when government budgets are under significant pressure. Yet infrastructure investment is important for stimulating economics. So what government can do? Face the challenges of enacting policies and public spending to both attract private capital to invest in infrastructure, and also they have to ensure that the infrastructure is consistent with the green and the climate resilience economy. As we mentioned, what can government do in order to reduce the climate change? Develop strategy infrastructure plans strongly coupled with national climate change goals, like what we have in our country, Mission 2030, Qatar National Vision. Also, they have to put a long-term infrastructure planning, recognizes opportunities to address both climate change, adaptation, and infrastructure planning and design. Infrastructure and emission. Infrastructure is core to any economy, building water, power system, and basic need for residential and business sector, while transportation, communication links, all enabling market to function. A green and efficient infrastructure support a high quality of life in countries and is critical to raising life standards. In fact, emissions are to a large extent depend on a choice and design of infrastructure system. Transformation of infrastructure in all countries is necessary. To address climate change goals, decisions on infrastructure investment are also critical for adapting to the continuing change in climate. Challenges of investment. The need to invest in infrastructure that in both low carbon and climate resilience comes at a time when the traditional source of infrastructure funding, government budgets, are under significant pressure. Government spending gross fixed capital fell from 8% to mid-90s to around 6% in 2014 relative to total government outlay. Since 1980s, private investment in infrastructure has grown to somewhat address the infrastructure gap, especially telecommunications infrastructure, and to a lesser extent power generation and railways. Some of the funding gap can be addressed through using infrastructure more efficiently, incorporating intelligent technology, demand management, and improved planning, increased private investment, and nonetheless essential to achieve the pace of transformation to LCR infrastructure. Risk and solution. Private sector investment in LCR infrastructures claim climate change poses risk to infrastructure investment, environmental risk due to more extreme weather, and also financial risk associated with the uncertainty in a process of transitioning to low carbon infrastructure. So the solution of the risk that they are facing for the infrastructure of climate change is investment to increase access, commercial banks, bond finance, project finance, and equity finance in developing countries, such as direct lending to repayable financing. How Qatar is facing the challenges. Qatar is one of the fast developing countries in every aspect, including thriving of infrastructure growth to the organizing FIFA 2020-30 World Cup. The statistical fact reveals that state of Qatar is among the countries whose per capita consumption of electricity and water is high, and according to the population growth consumption of electricity and water will continue to increase. As per demand forecast analysis between 2018 and 2022, electricity energy requirement is expected to grow at approximately 6.25 by 2022, the best scenario case. And demand of the water also expected to grow at approximately 4.5% by 2022 in business as a usual scenario. How Qatar is facing this challenge? Through the National Program of Conservation and Energy Efficiency Program, TERSHID, Qatar was able to bring down per capita consumption of water by 20% and of the electricity 18%, and CO2 emission by 8.4 million tons from 2012 to 2016, which has been a type of reforming policy and regulation in relation to technology standardization, application, and regulation in electricity and water. This brought down CO2 emission in the power sector from 46.8% in 2013 to 39.6% in 2016. Investment increased as an open market for new tools, device technology, and private investment increased. This is one of the examples that, as per the calculation that we have from 2013 to 2016, for example, here the reduction of natural gas as a total is 210 MCF, and reduction of CO2 emissions 8.4 million ton, and also reduction of million Qatar Riyal 3,780 for 4 years from starting of the conservation energy efficiency program. How Qatar is facing the challenges? We are going to implementing the green car initiatives, which will be adopted inshallah soon. And the idea about the green car, 10% of electric car should be replaced, 10% replaced by electric car by 2022 through private sector. And we have also cooperating with the Siemens in Doha. They are going to implement the station, about 100 stations within next 2 years. Also the second initiative is the Green Building Code, which is already revamping with the regulation and building code in Qatar with the leads, and also investment in greener renewable building in KAHRAMAA corporations by utilizing the rooftops and the parking tops. Final conclusion, the greatest incremental cost of low carbon development occur in the building and transportation vehicle sector, where much of the cost would be borne by the private sector. Additional investment is required to green the power sector. The technical interdependency and financial trade-offs between infrastructure systems suggest the potential to generate investment in LCR infrastructure to create a self-sustaining cycle of low-carbon growth. Most central to this growth are three interactions: increased generation of low-carbon electricity technically enables the greening of building and transportation vehicle. Decreased demand for oil and natural gas reduces the capital requirements for new infrastructure in these sectors. And finally, capital investment are moving to private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Aziz, Ahmed, Al-Hammadi, for this, I would say, perfect keynote introduction. This is summarizing exactly what we want to see out of these panelists. What are the challenges? What are the issues? How you have been able to solve them in general, and in particular with very specific examples. I think this is extremely concrete, including how you have moved the investment to the private capital. So this is what I would like with the next 6 panelists. You will have not 10 minutes each, but some 6, 7, 8 minutes, I would say. And I would like to, one by one, present yourself. I think we have a very good, I would say, diversity of persons who are in the private sector, who work with the finance sector, who are also with local authorities, and we have also some philanthropists. So this is a very interesting gathering from different perspectives on tackling this issue of mobilizing public and private investment for low carbon infrastructure and climate resilient development. You have been addressed 3 questions, and I will repeat them so that the participants know what are the questions being addressed. What are the challenges in mobilizing the investment needed to meet the low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure needs, and how can this challenge be addressed? So that is what we have got also on the keynote address. What tangible action can governments, regions, and cities pursue to encourage greater private sector engagement for investment in low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure? And last but not least, what are alternative sources and mechanisms for financing low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure? So first, who are you? In 1 minute, please tell the participants who you are. In 2 or 3 minutes, what are the issues and challenges that within your own position you are facing? And thanks to your position, how you have been able to solve and what kind of solution you did provided. So I will start in a non-protocol way, but the list that was given to me, I should have given the floor to Mr. Sean Kidney, who is the CEO and co-founder of Climate Bonds Initiative.
Well, what's the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge is fronting the volunteers at the Bonn zone across the river and saying, when they say, is there hope? And having to say, no. There is currently not hope. No. We are currently on a path to utter catastrophe for the future of our children. That is a challenge. I'm going to tell you, it's a challenge every morning, getting up and reading the science and thinking, what the hell are we doing with our planet when we've been told for 25 damned years that this has been going on? And we are not doing adequate, not anywhere near adequate enough to address the challenge. Emissions go up. They're supposed to be going down 4 to 6% per annum. As Christiana Figueres says, if they're not down 4 to 6% per annum by 2020 or 2021, all is lost. Qatar goes underwater, let alone Miami, let alone Cartagena, let alone most of the Netherlands. And that's just the easy part of what happens. We can deal with that. What we can't deal is the epidemics that come with climate shock. That we'll lose probably, according to most of my senior climate scientist friends, half the world's population, maybe 2/3 from epidemics. Where we'll see implosions of states. Where we will see massive desertification in the Amazon, for God's sake. We are dicing with our future in the most incredible fashion. And yet we continue to allow emissions to go up. So that's the challenge, Nick. How do you look at those volunteers in the face who are here helping and say, have you actually got a future? And I don't know. I don't know if I have. I've got children. I say to most people now, at the moment, on the current trajectory, there is no viable future for our children. Everything we're being told is it's not viable. Now, it's risk, right? It might be, what is it, 5% probability, 15%? It's about a 50% probability that we'll see 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warming, 4 to 6 metres sea level rising, according to Jim Hansen at NASA, by the end of this century. Cyclones are 3 times the intensity of Hurricane Irma, becoming the norm in tropical zones by about 2050, etc., etc., etc. You can go on. And it'll be the poor that will suffer most first, because that's where the famines will happen. But in the end, there will be no escape for any of us. It doesn't matter whether you can buy land in Siberia. Epidemics go everywhere. It'll be an equal opportunity killer. So death, there'll be no hiding in Norway. So that's the first challenge. I mean, the lunacy of this is that we know what to do. We have a pipeline. We've seen these vast numbers put in front of us. The new climate economy talks about how in the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to invest $90 trillion anyway in building emerging market infrastructure. We're going to be doing this where we don't even need to worry about retrofitting Germany, which is a big enough job. We've now got to do a vast job and make sure it's green. If it is not green, there is not even hope. If we build more freeways in Lagos, it's dead for the rest of us. It has to be mass transit. It has to be clean energy. It has to be sustainable water. It has to be changed agricultural practices that see reforestation on a vast scale on degraded land. About 50% increase in forest cover by 2050 is what we have to achieve. Changing agricultural practices so we stick carbon in the soil rather than take it out with maize. Changed food. It's a wholesale renovation of the way we run the planet, commensurate with this vast, scary realization that's come upon us in the last 20 years that we are stewards of the planet. We are not just animals rattling around like rats. We have, for better or for worse, without realizing it, taken control. We're messing it up at the moment. We now need to turn into being proper stewards of the planet. That's the challenge. Now, that's the bad news. It is very serious. And I urge you to go and speak to those volunteers and tell them what you think, really. Share it, because we all have to be mobilised. Okay, that's the bad news. 2 bits of good news. There is good news. At least there's enough for hope. We're human species, right? We're built on hope against crazy adversity. We have capital. Most of what has to be done can be funded. Most of it is green infrastructure. 80% of emissions come from cities now and the cities we are building in Brazil and India and Indonesia, the future emissions. This is investable, right? This is buildings, this is transport, this is water, this is infrastructure we've been building. This society outside that door was built in a pact between the private and the public sector to create the world we live in. We've just got to do more of that. There's no financial R&D required. The scale is unprecedented. The current valuation of infrastructure on the planet is $50 trillion US. We're going to build 90 trillion anyway, and we've got to make it green. So it is pretty big. But luckily, we know what to do, energy, transport, and so on. You find any sector specialists, dozens of them around the world, they will tell you what the blueprint is. They just don't know how to actually make the financing work and the ambition, the planning at government level work. We have the capital. We have $100 trillion in institutional investor capital represented by Sue Reid's members. And you know what is incredible, Nick, if I might say, this thing that does give me hope is that this capital is sitting around in big pools all around the place, like piles of yen over there, piles of dollars over there, not earning interest. 21% of capital in the European Union is invested in zero or negative rate interest. Sorry, I get so excited about this.
We love, you are passionate about it. This is what we need to hear, so please continue.
Well, it's not passion, it's terror about the future for my children. So we have the capital in Japan, in the US, in Australia, even in India, the Life Insurance Corporation. These are organisations that are looking for yield. They are not going to get yield in German bunds. They are not going to pay my pension by investing in zero interest rate bunds. We can give them the yield with green infrastructure investments around the world, especially in the emerging markets. As long as we manage the risk, we turn our development banks into risk mitigation agencies and so on. We can do this. And the capital wants green. At the Investor Summit that Sue Reid's going to be running in New York in January, we will have investors lining up in the US, one after another, saying, give us green finance, give us green bonds, we want it, bring it on. I was speaking to AXA, to Allianz earlier today. They can't get enough of this sort of stuff. Subject to risk and yield, there's all these challenges. So if Nick here is in Morocco and this chap has the money, someone has to be a risk bridger between them, and that's development banks. But at least they're interested. This could move very, very quickly because we have to find yield for all these funds. But we do have to act very, very quickly. Green bonds are evidence of investor demand. The market doubled last year, up 50% this year. It'll double again next year. It's about $300 billion outstanding. It's got to be $1 trillion a year before it's contributing properly. But we're well on the way to doing that. Everyone talks green bonds and climate finance. They understand it. It is a marketing concept. It's about marketing a green future instead of a brown or neutral future. So we have that beginning to happen. I can give you the evidence, the agenda going forward, because there is work to be done here. We need leadership. We need ambition. We're getting it in some places already. I mean, in the green bond market, Nigeria is issuing a green bond in a couple of weeks. Fiji just issued. France issued a huge one. KfW here. They keep rolling out. So that's leadership. We have the Chinese government and the Indian government grasping leadership by the horns at the moment, by planning to change their economies to green. China's been closing down coal-fired power stations this year, as you know, at vast scale. We don't have that ambition yet in most countries of the world. We need to get there. We need our development banks to rethink their role going forward. We need our investors to be aggressively calling for the money. But above all, we need our governments to do planning for this future. It's essentially urban infrastructure planning. If they would simply start planning for metros in Lagos, for sustainable water in Mumbai, and so on, we can fund it. So my opportunity, my answer to you, the fundamental solution to this ghastly challenge we have, the capital's there. The capital is there in spades. We're swimming in it. They want green. All they want is green investments. Our simple challenge here in this room is to go out and get these deals done, to ensure that financing is made. And if you want help with credit enhancement, if you want help with some kind of structuring, shout at a development bank or someone will come running. It's easy, right?
Thank you, Sean. I think that was outstanding. Yes, please an applause. So this is very appealing. I'm not going to do what we do. We were here this morning, and we are exactly trying to find the way to go through this path in order to have, I would say, bankable project in developing countries on infrastructure so that they are of interest for the investors. This is what we are trying to do. So the next speaker, it is Reid. You have a double challenge to be as passionate as Sean and to also tell us what are your solutions on the challenge that you are working specifically.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Great. Sean is, as always, a very tough act to follow. And to clear the record, I don't actually control $100 trillion. I wish I did. Maybe there would be a little bit less terror. I would like to think if that were the case. I will say that I bring to this discussion the lens of my organization, Ceres, which coordinates the investor network on climate risk and sustainability, 140 institutional investors in North America with $17.5 trillion in assets under management. And we work very closely with our global investor partners in the EU, Australasia, and Asia. And also collaborate with UNPRI and others. So we are coordinating at a global scale like never before in terms of, in particular, trying to solve the climate challenge in terms of financing global decarbonization to stabilize the climate, and also to varying degrees working to advance the sustainable development goals that you can't disentangle from the climate imperative. And Sean's, I've sort of now just thrown out what I had been planning to say, which was more mechanical in light of Sean's appropriately poignant and compelling remarks about the big picture and really the scale and urgency of what we need to tackle. And he's absolutely right that there is a lack of an understanding of the urgency here and the scale of the global challenge. And it's a global challenge, but also is acutely local at the same time and needs to be addressed at every level. And it's a challenge, the pace and scale of the solutions that need to be advanced. The world has never seen anything like this, so a shift in mindset is really crucial. Sean's also absolutely right that the world is awash in capital. There is more than enough capital out there to invest in the solutions, and what's missing is political will and the policies and structures to get us there, to set the frameworks for the flow of capital that we need. And in talking to the institutional investors in our network and beyond, what we consistently hear, and this is from the socially responsible investors to the venture capitalists to the big public pension funds and some of the biggest asset managers in the world, is lack of deal flow, deal flow, deal flow, deal flow. And it's interesting because you go out and talk to, say, renewable energy project developers and even multinational companies that are developers of clean energy, and they say, we can't access the capital that we need to really deploy at scale. And so that disconnect very much is a challenge that we have to confront. And the reality is that for a broad swath of institutional investors, there are very firm risk-return requirements. And there's a lot of anger and upset that there's not more and quicker investment from especially the pension funds or insurers into climate resilient and low carbon solutions. But they need to be able to serve their core public functions, like paying out pensions, paying out on insurance premiums. And there are ways to bridge these gaps. And that's why we are seeing investments. We see in our network, the Canadian pension funds, for example, have been able to go out and start to really scale up with investment in clean energy infrastructure in particular that meets their risk-return requirements. And they have sophisticated teams who are able to navigate this space, send the right signals in terms of what they need to see, and then the tools are made available, the investment opportunities are made available. And I think some of the European pension funds also are real leaders in this space. But based on the analysis that Ceres has done with Bloomberg New Energy Finance released last year, focused just on the electric power sector globally and what needs to happen to achieve even a 2-degree scenario by 2050, there's a huge gap between business as usual levels of clean energy investment and what's actually needed to stabilize the climate. And that's just the electric power sector alone. There's a multi-trillion-dollar gap. And there's no way we're going to get there, even with the phenomenal improvements in terms of the cost. The cost curve for wind and solar has been extraordinary and has blown away the projections of IEA and so many others. Everyone has underestimated the rate of deployment of clean energy and the cost curve reduction with solar in particular. And we see now energy storage on a similar trajectory. But even with those good news stories out there that these technologies are proven, they're more and more cost effective in outcompeting fossil infrastructure across the board, we still need policy interventions. There are so many market distortions that work against investment in low carbon and resilient infrastructure. The direct and indirect subsidization across the board of fossil fuels around the world that IMF, I think, last year estimated at somewhere in the ballpark of $5 trillion a year. That is a profound market distortion that influences investment at every scale, and we have to correct for that. It has to get beyond rhetoric and to real plans for changing these policies and regulations that are reinforcing a system that is not aligned to create the incentives for companies and investors, public entities to direct capital toward the solutions that we need immediately. And one of those elements is carbon pricing. So removing the direct and indirect subsidization of fossil fuels, but also carbon pricing increasingly is being deployed around the world. And you see really interesting correlations. It's hard to draw a perfect line because there are so many different factors involved, but it's really striking when you see different jurisdictions embrace carbon pricing and then you see triple-digit year-over-year increases in clean energy investment. There's something there. It really is helping to drive the solutions that we need. We also need long-term planning, and I think there are others involved in this conversation who can speak more to that, multi-decadal planning, because so many different pieces of infrastructure can look good in the short term in terms of resilience and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but as soon as you take that time lens out to 2040 or 2050, it can illuminate that the infrastructure is exactly the opposite of what you need, and you are either going to wind up with wasted capital or stranded assets, and you need that long-term planning. Great, thank you. And I wanted to urge that, often in our world there is a singular focus on tapping into the capital of institutional investors, and there's no question that institutional investors need to play a greater role, but there's so much opportunity as well for companies of all stripes to step up investment, and we're seeing it in renewables and energy efficiency, electric vehicle infrastructure, and public-private partnerships, that will help de-risk capital deployment, particularly in emerging economies for low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were speaking about regulation, so I think it is a good also introduction for a city. What at the city level, and you have responsibility to have Atlanta City being sustainable. So what are your challenges? What are your solutions? And what do you do to have those proper regulation to attract both investors and to make sure you don't invest in bad infrastructure, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, so that's a lot of questions there. So I think you kind of summed up the major challenges right now. What we're facing is an extinction crisis, not just climate change, but a sixth massive extinction. And it's going to take that type of united effort to be able to really fight that in a meaningful way and take that little bit of hope and really expand that. I think working for, by the way, I'm John R. Seydel. I'm the Director of Sustainability for Mayor Reid and his Office of Resilience. We were the Office of Sustainability, but 3 months ago we went to the Office of Resilience, and it just got endorsed by both of our major candidates last night. This is our strategy that we released last week. I would love to give you more information, or you can find it online at resilientatlanta.com. It's going to talk about a little bit of what I scratched the surface here. And so the challenges, I'd kind of look at it as opportunities to work together. I think climate change presents the issue for humanity to put a lot of our differences aside, whether it's skin color, whether it's religion, whether it's geographic, and work together on solutions that, you know, that it's not like these solutions disempower people. It's not like these solutions make our air dirtier to breathe, you know, cut life expectancy. These are things where you're going to be creating trillions of dollars in an advanced, resilient energy economy, no matter what type of feature you want to have. And that's just the energy sector. What I want to talk about is representing cities. It's not one city that's going to do it alone. I think this, the whole idea of, especially here, representing the United States, who doesn't have an actual pavilion, but yes, we do. We have a pavilion right outside, and we are still in, united with thousands of other cities, states, country, and internationally wide, saying that the United States is still in, along with our universities and businesses. And when you're talking about cities altogether, that's 75% of greenhouse gas emissions right there. So if you want to meaningfully take on these challenges, you got to get right first in the cities. And then you can scale those models and share with one another. So what I'm getting at is the ability to create scalable models at such a quick level, because you're collaborating not every year, not every month, but every week. Every week you're on calls. We are Resilient Atlanta because we're with 100 resilient cities, which you'll be able to talk about because we're partnered with some of your partners in China and across the spectrum. So it's not just United States cities that we're looking at, it's international cities. So some of the things that we're looking at that I think, you know, trying to make it rememberable, tweetable, there's a lot of information out here. One of them is with our resilient food systems. We were the first city to have an urban ag director, and we're creating that model for other cities to do the same by being able to create jobs in a way where we partnered with the public-private sector. One example is turning power line easements, so all this land for hundreds of years not being used and having just these power lines going across it, and you have grass that's just been mowed. It's a complete waste of space until now, where we're actually turning those into food gardens and employing people and also educating young people to get into the agriculture industry, which is actually the first and largest industry in the state of Georgia. And so you're creating a resilient local food system while also being able to pick up and get the next generation ready for employment in our largest industry. Another really couple exciting ones is, and this one's personal, is we're having a design competition for Ted Turner Drive, and that would be funded and led by Renew Atlanta, who's in charge of all of our infrastructure development and uses T-SPLOST funding to actually get that done. And so we're going to have this design competition with all these different colleges within the city of Atlanta, saying exactly what we need, something that's representative of whether it's green infrastructure, whether it's energy production, whether it's a mix of all the above. And so that's going to be happening next year. And so that's an example where we're taking public dollars, where we're taking the institutions, the experts, along with the professors to actually make and develop a competitive angle so that we can have the best project possible to fund. And then we have Turner Enterprises actually, you know, putting in the money for this competition. And so there's multiple ways of doing this. I am more than excited to meet anybody afterwards. We have a 100% clean energy goal, which is going to take a lot more than just the city to push. And we're coming out with our plan in January. But these are just scratches on the surface. And by ourselves, it's not going to do much for the globe as far as climate action. But when united with 7,000 other cities worldwide, that's going to make a heck of a difference.
Thank you. So you are giving here a lot of good hopes, a lot of good example. And as a city, you can catalyze whether at the local level, I mean community level, whether at the university level, whether at your infrastructure level, and even at state level, as an example, and globally, how your different coalition can make it happen by exchanging experience and go forward. So thank you to give those hope, because from Europe, sometimes you fear about what's happening within the White House, that you withdraw, but yes, you have given the message, you will stand up. So this is excellent to hear. So we go to another city, to London, I believe. And I will give the floor, to Mark Jenkinson, and after I'll come back to Hong Kong to know about philanthropist.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. And I actually live and work in London, although I'm not representing London, but I can tell you a bit about London. I'm based at Siemens, and we have what we call our Global Centre of Competence for Cities. So lots of very competent people and me, so that's why I'm here. They're all somewhere else doing something useful. But we work, very closely with London and cities around the world. And I guess just to take the sort of question 2 first, which is what can government do, or what and local government. And I guess it just builds on some of the points that Sue and Sean and John just raised. Is that we need a long-term policy, a long-term vision. This kind of stuff that John's got is great because without a long-term vision, how can the private sector and NGOs, universities, how can they plan and invest and skill up the people that, the future, obviously the future is tomorrow, or yesterday, but how can we get the people ready to actually start to introduce these solutions? So, and also we heard about Qatar and also their national program. So basically we need government to set a long-term vision. And in the UK, for example, we've need to get the private sector and others involved. That was a bit of a plug for Siemens in the UK, but our UK CEO was asked by the government to lead a group of private sector companies to actually look at the future of manufacturing, the future of industrial digitalisation, and how that could help the UK. Obviously, we're also competing on a global basis, and there's a thing called Brexit, which some of you may have heard about. But how can we actually make sure that we're resilient as a country? And so the big focus on, if you have a long-term program, if you invest in skills, if you invest in digitalization, you invest in people, then you can actually create 455 billion of extra revenue for the actual sector. You can create an extra 175,000 jobs, and you can actually save CO2, reduce CO2 by 4.5%, and that's just in the UK alone. But having said that, the national government has to set the policy. But if you speak to some of the local London leaders, they would say, well, government, you set the policy, get out of here now, because we're the ones who actually want to implement it, and we're the ones that can, with the people, because cities can't just do it as an administration. They need the people to get on board. Cities are where it's really going to be the answer, and again, John mentioned that. I'll probably tell a little bit of a story, actually. We've partnered with C40, and we had the Climate Leadership Awards in New York back in 2014, and the day before, it was actually the UN Climate March. So we thought, let's go along and join it, because let's have a look to see what it's about. And 100,000 people walking through New York, is really awe-inspiring. And you've got thousands and thousands of people on the sidewalk, in fact, we ended up joining the march. It wasn't until afterwards we realised we were actually in the indigenous peoples section, but it was three Brits, one's got ginger hair from Scotland. But it was really kind of inspiring, and really kind of brought home the fact that it's also down to the people and the cities where you can actually make a difference. And about the money, I think one thing that cities don't, well, you've got 17 trillion, so if 100 or 17 trillion, that's great. I guess if cities have access to the money, we do find sometimes, obviously Atlanta's the exception, some cities don't actually know how to spend it. Where do they prioritise the investment? And another plug for Siemens, but we've developed something called the Siemens City Performance Tool. So again, you can, after you've Googled the report, you can Google Siemens City Performance Tool. But we've worked with cities and we look at their population growth, if they're growing, look at their CO2 reduction targets, look at their air quality targets. And then we look at a combination of technologies within buildings, energy, transport, and we can see the impact of this combination of technologies on reducing CO2, on improving air quality, also how many jobs does it create, because obviously that's also important for mayors, and also how much does it cost. So we've done, I don't know how much time I've got left, but I give one example. Is anyone from here from Munich or Vienna? Good, I'll tell a story then. We've got reports from Munich and Vienna, and we looked at, if you were to introduce e-vehicles into your cities, 20% of your fleet, what would the impact be on CO2 reduction? And we looked at, well, Vienna actually would be a 9% CO2 reduction, whereas in Munich only 5%. And then we said, well, how can that be? And so well, maybe they drive longer distances in Vienna, or maybe they drive more in Vienna. Actually, the average person drives 15 kilometers per day in Vienna versus 18, and the average person, or most people, 37% of people drive in Vienna versus 57% in Munich. So we looked at, well, it's actually your energy mix. So 50% of Germany's energy mix it was heard on the last session, again another Siemens employee, is hard coal lignite. So we said to Munich, unless you've got $17 billion or $1 trillion of cash, maybe you should focus on cleaning up your energy and making sure it's clean and renewable before you roll out your e-vehicles. Clearly for air quality, it's better, but if your finances are tight, then focus on that. So again, that's something we can help to do.
Thank you very much. We go to the next panelist, Mr. Evanse. We know each other. You are I would say, a very specific profile here as a panelist coming from the philanthropic sector from Hong Kong, which is really going pretty fast now on climate change issues. So can you give us also your own experiences, your own challenges as a philanthropist to mobilize even more finance in order to make it happen, not only in Hong Kong, the Greater China, and I would say broader in the world?
Sure. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I wear a couple hats, but one of the hats I wear is as a head of a family foundation. And historically, we haven't been involved in this area of climate change. And of course, being a global citizen and I think the climate argument has been made, and we have been shifting more in this direction. And we've also created a platform that looks at getting other philanthropists to engage more in climate. And so I'm actually going to look at the opportunities for philanthropy to engage in this COP process, because I think one of the things that I've heard is that there isn't a whole lot of philanthropists here. And so one of the reasons for that, I think, is that there's something I start to talk about in distinguishing this new kind of philanthropy that we're championing, which we call hard philanthropy, versus the soft kind of philanthropy that we're all very familiar with. The hard kind of philanthropy is ones in which philanthropists lead the conversation, can build coalitions, and come up with a vision and reach out to the private sector as a second, and then maybe bring it to the level of government. I think Michigan, what happened in Michigan a couple of years ago with a group of foundations coming up with a vision for Detroit's urban and economic renewal is I think the case study that everyone looks at as being a kind of a new philanthropy. In terms of climate, we're looking at this context of cities because we think this is very important. We believe that climate philanthropy is something that all philanthropists should have the ability to engage with. And we've been on a listening tour for the last year and a half, speaking to existing climate funders and just different foundations and philanthropists in general as to why they find climate philanthropy so difficult to grapple with. The first reason, of course, is that there's a notion that this conversation belongs with government, and we're not government. The second, of course, is the fact that this is just such a large, overwhelming subject, and given the small pool that philanthropy does have, that they just don't feel they're able to grapple with. And so these are the two entry points that we've been really looking at and trying to make climate philanthropy more accessible. And one way to do that also is to situate it within the context of cities. So foundations have long established roots in cities and can get behind a plan that is tangible and that helps their city become more resilient and climate adaptable. The other way that philanthropy, I think, can help in this larger conversation is to broaden the conversation. And so I had the pleasure of meeting Paul Hawken last year. I don't know, maybe some of you are familiar with his book, Project Drawdown, but it illustrates, it's right now a New York Times bestseller, I think it's number 4 or 5, and outlines the most comprehensive plan to reverse global warming. And for so long, I think, from a philanthropist perspective, the conversation has been dominated entirely by energy and transport. And Paul, what he does is he lists the hundreds most substantive solutions to reverse global warming. And there's some real surprises in the top 10. I think number 1 is refrigerants, and there's a whole, of the top 10, 5 of them have something to do with food. And number 7 is education of women and girls. So broadening that sort of portfolio of climate actions is one way I think that philanthropy can better engage. The other one, of course, is we've been having this conversation with folks, is that we're not going to get really much further sort of in the whole conversation if we can't make this conversation on climate action more tangible, if we don't get more public support behind us. And so we're looking at how we can make climate communications to make climate action more tangible, accessible, and actionable to the average person, because I think that's really important. And the third one, I'm so glad that gentleman said about the existential threat. I think this is something that I think we try not to focus on because we understand that we need to be hopeful. But the climate reality, I think, is something that that it is an existential challenge. I think it has to be said more positively, but also just said. And I think we're all sort of working on a lot of notions, and I think philanthropy especially, sort of on these 20th century narratives. And one of the things we really want to help focus on is these 21st century narratives. And 21st century narratives essentially revolve around sustainable development. And we've had a wonderful start with the global goals, and they provided a framework for conversations. And but I think we shouldn't stop there. We should use the global goals as a framework to build on. And I think philanthropy has a unique role. It can help bridge these cross-sector partnerships. And it can also, more importantly, help supply the vision, because I think these new narratives are also very important, because until you find that narrative, I think to some sense we've lost our story right now. And until we can find and paint that narrative, that'll also give us a better chance at getting there.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And this is also, I would say, a very high venue for investing on climate change, I would say, infrastructure. I know we had started some discussion also about blending finance. How can philanthropy, kind of de-risk a number of projects whereby development banks can add on, whereby at the end, the private investors can put their money on a completely de-risked project. So this is, I would say, fascinating, and I know we are working on that, establishing a new fund with blending finance. So I think here there are also a lot of hopes of accessing the funds, especially for developing countries and emerging markets. Last but not least, Monsieur Henri Balsan, so you are president of Advancity cluster. Can you tell us also who you are? What are your challenges that you face on your day-to-day professional basis? And what are the solutions that you have already provided, giving your vision of what should be done to go on to have a better planet?
Well, thank you. I'll try to after this very brilliant panel. First of all, you will have to excuse my French accents, and I'll try to do my best.
You are excused for me also.
So yes, Advancity is a cluster. We call it the Smart Metropolis Hub, and the goals of the cluster of Advancity are identify and shape tomorrow's sustainable city projects. So maybe we'll go with Atlanta. Focus on the relationship between the community and the city, which is very often left apart. And focus on what we call the 4C, to have a city that is competitive, creative, communicative, and able to reach a consensus. To reach those goals, Advancity gathered numerous technology developed with major groups, small companies, and even startups. And I can tell you that the problem to go to a low carbon issue is definitely not a technological problem. The technology does exist. So, what is the problem? Or what are the challenges that we need to focus on to develop more rapidly low carbon technology? I would mention 3 of them. First, with the public contractors, or maybe some private contractors as well, are very reluctant to launch innovative projects because they consider, right or not, but they consider that final cost will exceed significantly the initial cost of the project and suffer late delivery. The second challenge is with governments that they are rather keen to subsidize new solutions because they are sustainable, or they believe they are sustainable, instead of taxing old solutions that we definitely know that they are not sustainable. The consequence of this is that when you are an entrepreneur, you are more focused on how to get the subsidies than to develop technology and focus on the business model. I would like to quote, for instance, the problem of the solar photo cell development in France in the early 2010s, and that was really a big mess. And the third reason is more philosophical, that generally speaking, and it is a very universal law, that we usually prefer to select the easiest way to do things instead of go to the more complicated solution. To illustrate this, I would like to focus on the transports and mainly the road transport. Should I remind you that transport means energy? And back to secondary school, each mobile that is in movement needs an energy that is proportional to its weight and that grows accordingly to the square of the speed. Secondary school. Very easy. Actual transport represents some 60% of dioxide of carbon emission. And out of the 60%, 95% is due to road transport. The other 5 remaining is the 3, air, sea, and railway. So 95% is road transport. And why? Because we use thermic engines. And why do we use thermic engines? Because it is easy and cheap. It is easy to store gasoline in a tank, and it is not easy to store electricity. But back to technology, I'll remind again that the first car to exceed the speed of 100 kilometers an hour was an electric car, not a thermic engine car. So technology exists. This is not the problem. 99% of transport is thermic, except in Norway and some other places, but mainly in Norway is only 70%. So, what do we need to do if we want to meet the goal of the low carbon and the figures that you have quoted? Basically, this is definitely electrical cars. And to reach this objective, we have four drivers. First is sourcing the electrical energy. Of course, if you source electrical energy by using coal or oil, you are all wrong. Since electricity is rather difficult to store, the solution to have a car with an acceptable long-distance mobility is definitely hydrogen. Hydrogen is one of the 2 components of water, And again, if you are back to secondary school, you probably remember that with electricity, in water, you can separate hydrogen from oxygen, and you get hydrogen rather easily. Okay. Second driver is infrastructure. Infrastructure is key because you need to refill your battery. Thousands of plugs are required to be deployed, and the decision is in the head of the community. Indeed, it is not possible to load all cars at the same time, so this means that the network has to be smart, and that we call a smart grid. Another option is to have the tramway system and have electric wires above your head for the cars, and then you can reload your batteries when you are driving. The third driver is data. Why data is key? Because car occupation rate from home to work is 1.1 instead, and you have 4 seats in a car. If we reach 1.5, this would eradicate 90% of the traffic jams. And we know that traffic jam is the main issue for air pollution. Share taxi is 5%. Share car are less than 1%. Almost a third of cars driving in the streets are looking for a park, for a place to park. And trucks, 80% of the trucks on their way back after unloading are empty. So data is key. And last is tax on dioxide of carbon. And I would like to give an example of price of dioxide of carbon. Probably some of you are using this small machine that allow you to have your own sparkling water at home. This machine built by Siemens or Philips or whatever. You know how you buy this? You have to do that, you have to buy a cartridge where there is dioxide of carbon in it. It costs roughly 30 euros, well, average, depends where you go. And inside the cartridge, you have 500 grams of dioxide of carbon. So you get 500 grams of dioxide of carbon for 30 euros. If you go per ton, this means 60,000 euros per ton for dioxide of carbon that you are ready to pay for your own purpose. And we are discussing a carbon tax of 50 euros, 100 euros. So there is a huge space in between. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very concrete example. And if I may add on that, because we have spoken just before, we are working ourselves on a waste management project in Algeria. And the story I'm going to tell you, it is a reality that you have everywhere in developing countries, emerging countries. We are collecting plastic bottles. I'm not going to name any company, but there are many plastic bottles that are being spread away, which is at the end going to the ocean. That makes a lot of pollution. So those plastic bottles are being collected on informal way. They're being packed and they're being sent from Algeria to China, selling at 60 euros per ton of plastic, for which Algeria, because it is exporting a product, they add on as a subsidy 20 euros per ton of plastic. So this plastic is leaving Algeria at 80 euros per ton of plastic. It's going to China. China treat it, clean it, put it in flux, and then they send it to Germany, and they sell it at 200 euros per ton, the plastic. Then Europe, and in this case, because we are here in Germany, they do treat it, and they do put it in a small bottle as a raw material in which any company is buying those to inflate and to put the liquid that you need to have in this plastic, and they sell it to Algeria at 600 euros per ton. So Algeria is sending products, and I'm not speaking about the carbon footprint of the ton of plastic here. They are sending it at 60 euros, and they have to rebuy it at 600 euros. So in terms of social impact, in terms of economic impact, in terms of environment impact, the margin of doing something good is just enormous, exactly as you were saying with the ton of carbon. So there are many, many opportunities that we have seen around these panelists in terms of attracting investment, attracting finance. So we have 15 minutes to give the floor to panelists. You have, I would say, the chance to have brilliant panelists here with a lot of experiences. So can you give you the floor and ask several questions, and then the panelists will have another 15 minutes to answer your questions.
Thank you.
And please present yourself also to know who you are.
Yes, my name is Yoganandan. I am founder manager of a cooperative company which is dedicated to fighting climate change, biodiversity loss, resources, inequalities, and last but not the least, what I call closed identities. Because as Mr. Balsan said, I think all the technological solutions are there. If we have difficulty in putting them into effect, it is because we are suffering from closed identities. I would give one example. Very rich Middle Eastern country invests a lot in France, in football clubs, in real estate. This capital could be used to much better effect financing transfer of technologies to the poorer countries. Now, what I wanted to say was that I had three things: that we need a long-term vision, that we need urban infrastructure planning, the capital is there. So what is the problem? Amongst other things, something which has not been mentioned, I think there is a question of corruption, the question of long-term and short-term. Politicians always have to think of the short-term, except when they are dictators and they can have a military rule, they have to be re-elected. So even when the long-term vision is there, and I know some very good long-term visions which were published for COP21, the ground reality is extremely different. The second reason why it is difficult, it is because there are industrial and financial lobbies which still have to amortize past investments. Take the example of Total, which goes on investing in research for petrol, research for gas, etc., knowing full well that we cannot use all that has been already discovered. Since I've been asked to close, I will mention the last thing. I think what counts is not taken into account in the sense that the environmental and social impact is not accounted for. So investment decisions are still being taken on a purely financial basis. There's a question of corporate social responsibility here. Thank you.
Thank you for your remark. I don't know if someone wants to answer this question about, social impact investing.
Why don't you take a couple first?
Yeah, let's take two other questions then. There is a lady, yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Irene Hell. Thank you for this really cool sessions here. I really appreciate your action approach, action-oriented approach. Mr. Tse, on the vision of your foundation is to focus on the global spirit that unites us all. Wonderful. So I would love to hear a little bit about what your foundation is doing. And I would love, from Region 20 Director, there are so many cool examples. You just mentioned Algeria. Can we have more examples what you're doing, Regions 20? And I would love to hear a little bit more about this plan to raise $1 billion for climate action. So what is your vision for the next years and what's already been achieved? Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Hmm? Yeah. Yes.
And there is a third one, and then we will ask the panelists. By the way, I am the moderator. I'm not supposed to do a presentation, but why not?
Hi, my name is Rod Richardson. I'm with the Grace Richardson Fund. We do the kind of hard philanthropy that Ivan was mentioning. Our mission is to design and pioneer new public policy ideas of a free market nature to critical issues that are in gridlock. What I wanted to ask the panel about is policy innovations, policy innovation ideas that you know about that can deliver trillion-dollar solutions, which is what we need. Tomorrow, Professor Michael Mealing from MIT, who has called for new policy approaches beyond simply carbon pricing, and I will be exploring an idea that we've developed within the last year called clean tax cuts. In this case, we're specifically looking at one kind of clean tax cut mechanism, which is the tax-exempt green bond. A group at Columbia earlier this March proposed that if you targeted tax exemption for corporations, banks, and private developers on bonds that that finance clean assets, that have a proven waste or emission reduction capability, you could have a fantastic impact. It would be a financing mechanism that would reduce the cost of capital for these developers more than almost anything else you could do, and would provide an investment vehicle that, at least in the US context, every retiring baby boomer would want to put into their portfolio because of the high tax-exempt yield that these kinds of securities would develop. Tomorrow we'll be talking about that, but I wanted to get your comments and thoughts on how that might fit in with things that you're doing in your organizations with climate bonds and Ceres and the city of Atlanta. If you could use a vehicle like that as part of your solution base, and if you know of any other policy innovations that you would like to explore. We, as Ivan said, there's a role for private philanthropy in sparking these kinds of new explorations. And we'd like to invite you to join us in this discussion.
There are a lot of calls over here. Who would like to jump? Carbon bonds?
I mean, I can answer at least give my take on the first and third, even though the first was kind of, like I said, 3 questions. So overall, for urban infrastructure, when I said it takes thousands of cities working together to make real change, I should have mentioned, especially with the resilience, being in the Office of Resilience and working with Rockefeller. I mean, to my right, you're working with the private industry through Siemens, who's actually a platform partner for Rockefeller, along with hundreds of other private sector as well as public sector entities that are offering, whether it's in-kind donations, discounted services. And so through that type of hard philanthropy that Rockefeller's provided, it's given an avenue for that. So being able to collaborate, not just with cities, but with partners that can actually help the implementation phase a lot quicker. With our Resilient Atlanta strategy, we actually directly target what you were questioning about. So page 100 and 101 talks about the overall just getting to the financing and how you can actually make resilience and sustainability part of infrastructure deals, not just within all the major departments within the city of Atlanta, but how do you get other outside sources to have that checklist. So I would check that out. And then just dealing with corruption and transparency. I think transparency, that's the #1 thing, especially if you want to get young people on board and engaged, because nothing's going to get done at the city level if you don't have the buy-in from the community. And that the young people are usually the ones that are missed. And so in order to get them to be a part of it, got to really address transparency. That's on page 102. Getting them involved in another level. We have the technology to be able to know exactly what's being voted on, when it's being voted on. And when you're talking about a city level, even in a city like Atlanta, it takes 5 to 10 people. And this is our potential city council president. It takes 5 to 10 people reaching out, which I have 5 people in my family, my direct family, 2 sisters and my parents, to make them readjust their own policy. And so, I mean, that's what we're talking about on a local level. And so citizens, you got companies, private sector, you work with philanthropy and foundations like Rockefeller and the C Foundation, Turner Foundation, and work together, not separately in isolated silos, but work together collaboratively in a transparent and powerful way, and scalable way.
Thank you very much.
I'd love to jump in on the first and third questions as well. One of the elements of the first question was about the disconnects between investment needs and capital being made available. And there are a lot of different categories of disconnects, but there are three I would flag. One is scale. Often projects are way too small to meet the thresholds for investors in terms of what makes sense from a transaction cost perspective. And so building on tools that we already have and know in terms of aggregation of projects and coupling with investment vehicles like asset-backed securities to really make clean investment accessible to meet the risk-return requirements of investors. We know how to do this, but that disconnect has to be bridged. Risk and corruption was one that was mentioned, but political volatility, currency volatility, there's a whole range of risks that has to be addressed, and there are a whole range of solutions. One that I would flag and has come up a little bit in this conversation is more focused deployment of public and development finance as first loss capital, de-risking capital to help address that, to really drive in the private finance. And time horizon is another one. When you're talking with institutional investors like pension funds and life insurers, there's a lot of appetite, especially for infrastructure where there's a long time horizon on the investment. So matching up the finance vehicles for infrastructure with those requirements of the investors is key. A separate element of the first question I just wanted to quickly touch on is Total. And I think that's a really interesting story that while they have a long way to go, they were one of the first oil and gas majors to take up 2-degree scenario analysis and really look at how their business and investment plans and practices fare in a world committed to decarbonization under the Paris Agreement. And they committed as a result of this analysis to shifting 20% of their CapEx to clean energy by 2030. It is nowhere near far enough, fast enough, and they're continuing to invest in natural gas and talk about that as a big part of the story, but it's the beginning, together with Statoil and a handful of other companies that are starting to do this long-term analysis with the decarbonization lens. It's actually translating into some capital shifts. And then as to the third question, I will just quickly respond. There's a whole panel discussion you could have in response that it comes down to the basics. There's no silver bullet, but we need to tax or internalize the cost through whatever means is available, what's bad and what we don't want, in this case, largely high carbon, and incent what's good. And honestly, even taxing what we don't want, the carbon element, can help enormously in terms of alleviating some of the existing market distortions, and especially with the dramatic increase in cost competitiveness of clean solutions. That may be enough, but we will still look, especially stateside, for a range of incentives that can be directed toward clean energy, EVs, and so on, in part because we have these existing distortions. And there is, I think, unsurprisingly, not an appetite at the federal level right now to do anything about that. So we need to be creative and nimble and advance state policies that will embrace incentives as well as addressing some sort of pricing on the negative.
So I'll just dive in, then my friend Siemens will dive in. Siemens, by the way, is one of the hero companies of the world because it's invested a huge amount in developing competencies around green buildings, around mass transit and cities. So just want to applaud them for their work in this area. And slowly getting out of the fossil fuel industry too. Slowly. Three areas of work where we're working that are relevant to this. One of areas of work is climate bonds, which is a taxonomy, a green taxonomy. What are the investments consistent with the Paris Agreement that need to be made or refinanced? And that's going to be morphing into a European Union taxonomy launched at the Macron Summit, which will be a guidance for European investors about what are the right kind of investments to go into because of climate change and so on. So that's one thing. Ceres organisation sits on the board of that. It's a board of about $30 trillion represented by various associations, the certification. That makes it easier for people to figure out what to do and not to do because most people don't get access to the climate science and can't figure out, well, hang on, is this kind of building the right kind of building given what the problem? Is this sort of agriculture the right kind of agriculture? The expertise isn't everywhere. Two, And we've got about $20 billion of certified bonds of the 100 billion issued this year, just to give you a flavour. The second project we work on is around supporting organisations figuring out their green infrastructure plans and bring them to investors. We do a lot of work with taking emerging markets, the rich countries, forums for Indian green bond issuers, Brazilian issuers, and so on in London or Paris. We also are promoting capital raising plans, which is essentially taking a green infrastructure plan for a city, maxing out the ambition. Don't start hard, soft, start hard with what you know, and then figure out how can we raise the money using the toolkits that we know. There's a whole, speaking of public policy, the whole toolkit work in this area. You know, it's a lot more than tax. Tax is great. In the US, it's great. You're not going to get tax muni bonds in most other countries, maybe China in the next few years. But there are a dozen and one other tools that governments they can use. You can use floor pricing for various things. That's what we do with freeways. We give a floor pricing and allow institutional investor to have a good 75-year return by reducing the risk for them. We can regulate out product, like Norway is regulating out electric vehicles, as are the big cities in China. And by the way, Mercedes-Benz and co, please stop talking diesel and just keep talking electric vehicles. Get rid of that problem. So there's a bunch of things we can do around the sorts of tools that have been used in the past to get private capital to invest in public and to make the assets viable. A good example, one of our big projects at the Inter-American Development Bank is around value capture models in mass transit. We shouldn't be paying for mass transit with taxpayers' dollars. We're going to save that for the crisis we're going to have to deal with all the time. We can do it by developing property on top of stations, capturing the value and paying for the subway, as MTR does in Hong Kong, one of my heroes, MTR in Hong Kong. So there's a bunch of things we can do in those areas. Last thing we do is we promote a green city bonds. In fact, we're starting up, this might be interesting to Atlanta, a 100% green bonds commitment campaign in the US, looking for cities who will by 2025 have all their bonds being green, because everything will be filtered through mitigation or resilience. It's achievable. Now, we already have this, lots of green city bonds, New York MTA, BART, in San Francisco. I think you've done one, haven't you, in Atlanta? Speaking about doing a bond, Los Angeles, etc. There are bonds all around the world. In Hong Kong, which is, of course, is a city rather than a state. The new finance minister, James Lau, has been fantastic in galvanising energy there. And I just want to put this to Ivan. And now we're talking about having wastewater bonds coming out of Hong Kong and various things. This is a big movement. We need to grow a global muni market. Some places there'll be a tax element. In other places there'll be regulatory requirements to ensure that not just municipalities, but institutions within cities, transport authorities, water authorities, and so on, issue bonds and make this a large liquid market so we can invest in the greenness of our own cities going forward. Last thing, just remember, because it's my last word. No, go ahead. It is urgent. Whatever you do, every pore of your body, think this is the challenge of our species in our millennia. Run, don't walk.
Ivana.
Thank you for your question. There are a couple of ways I could answer it, but I think I'll answer it from the perspective of one of the other areas that I think you're referring to our website, that we're the foundation is very interested in championing, is this thing that we're calling 21st century philanthropy. And what we mean by that is we acknowledge that we live in a fundamentally different time in human history. And it requires a different perspective on philanthropy. Because historically, as we know, philanthropy is sort of the haves giving to the have-nots. And this new situation is that we're all sort of in the have-nots category. And so that really is a way to drive this sort of new conversation. The global part that you're mentioning is that we're really advocating that more philanthropists become what we call global philanthropists. Because what we've noticed is that, of course, all the challenges that face us in the 21st century are essentially global challenges. And most of philanthropy, as we know, is national, and people are focused in that way. But we believe that there's an opportunity and there's a must for philanthropists to have a certain bandwidth to look at these global issues that only we can tackle together. And so this is the reason the foundation created this separate entity called Global Friends, which is a platform that hopefully more philanthropists can come together and collaborate on. It's a common platform because we think that the day is over that one foundation, no matter who you are, can lead this kind of movement. That it needs to be some neutral space that is more equitable, that people can come together and sort of address these challenges. We're based in Hong Kong, so we're historically a Chinese foundation. We've been around for 30 years. So I've been sort of steering this in a direction that's more, I think, up to date. So in the West, we've created Global Friends. Our first initiative is this climate action plan, so looking at climate philanthropy. And then in China, I don't know if some of you are aware, the Chinese government has spearheaded a movement that started in 2009 called the ecological civilization. And that's terribly exciting because on one hand, it's a policy innovation in China, but it's a completely, potentially a new way of looking at economic development, a way of looking at our future. And so the other part of what we do in China is sort of promoting and helping realize this ecological civilization.
You wanted to add one thing?
One word, because my finance is not my part, but I'd like to jump into what Sue said about Total and their investments in natural gas, because it is not written here, but I am also one of the top executives of Engie. And Engie did sell their natural gas to Total. The amount of the transaction is not secret, it's about 1.5 billion euros. And those 1.5 billion euros are going to be invested 100% in clean energy. The result is that the value of the share since 2 years have dropped by almost 75%. But definitely it's a long-term choice.
You wanted to say one thing, and I will take also the opportunity that a question was addressed to me to tell you what we are doing in this field that you are all working on.
Okay. I was going to try and get you off the hook, but okay. Thanks to Sean. There's, I guess, one kind of example of a project which kind of answers all three. Part of the questions was the project called Sharing Cities, which is an EU-funded project which we're working on, which is basically London, Milan, and Lisbon. Now it's small. It's 24 million euros, so nothing for you. It's too small, but it's looking at taking waste heat and providing that for 1,000 homes, and providing the local community with basically getting them away from leaving their window open whilst in the middle of December, with pumping out heat and energy, and trying to show them that and give them cheaper energy, but also change their behaviour. So that's quite a nice little project. But what we're looking at is how do we scale it up? So we're looking at if we had 500 million euros, it's probably still a bit small, how can we actually scale it up between London, Milan, and Lisbon, also across the EU and also across the world? Now, obviously, it's a Horizon 2020 project, so fairly short term, but the idea is obviously to look longer term. Over to you.
Thank you. What we are doing in terms of concrete example as well, I mean, here you have mostly, I would say, industrialized countries. What we are doing, taking what we have started in Algeria, but also in Mali, now in Côte d'Ivoire, and other countries, including Thailand and so on, we are trying to facilitate the process being a subnational authorities who is in need of green infrastructure to respond to the basic access to services that the citizens are asking to have a better city, access to clean water, access to waste management, access to renewable energy. I mean, 60% of citizens in Africa still don't have access to electricity, to have LED street lighting in cities, example. So we are bringing those together technologies to discuss with those public entities in order to have a project which is designed in a way that can attract investors. So we are making the feasibility studies in order to make sure that those projects can be bankable and then can be offered to the investors. But by the way, you hardly find an investor on a 20 or 25 million US dollar project, on a waste management project, or an LED street lighting, because it is too small. If you talk about the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, this is too small. So we are, I would say, taking a portfolio of projects to make them bankable, and we do create our own fund with impact investment manager who can blend the finance with different sources of funding, and then to be the anchor investor of those different projects. So we have just launched this morning our first subnational climate fund, a 350 million facility, in order to have this market being business as usual in the next 10 years, to reply very in detail to your question. We still have 4 minutes. Should we stop here, or we have 1 or 2 urgent questions? I can see 1 hand, 2 hands. So let's take the 3 questions, and then we have 1 or 2 answers, and then we will close there.
Thank you. My name is Jean-Claude Schmitz. I am a consulting engineer, and I come from Luxembourg. I have one comment to make, and especially for Monsieur Henri Balsan, the cost of the CO2. You know, it's still free, or almost free, to blow CO2 out into the air. That is a big problem. That makes all the things that we want to do not efficient, financially speaking. So my proposal is to have the price of carbon equivalent to the price or the cost of taking the carbon out from the air again and putting it back into the soil. And that is something that you could, you know, defend in any discussions, because the damage you make, you should pay for its removal. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
As in French, you said the bon sens. Can we have a second question? The second question?
High carbon price.
Hi, I'm Hannah Rothschild from ICLE Local Governments for Sustainability. And my question is, we've heard a lot about investment, the millions, the billions, the returns. Why, and I know that Sean Kidney, you touched on it ever so slightly, why haven't we mentioned divestment? Why aren't we talking about the losses that companies can incur in terms of making our planet greener and more sustainable? Why are we only talking about the benefits and not actually the sort of responsibilities that these companies have in terms of actually taking on the risks instead of de-risking investments and actually cutting down on the investments? I know that ENGIE sold their gas industries, but that meant that Total bought them. So we're not actually making the planet a greener place. Thank you.
2 answers, 3 answers?
Yes, we should divest. Is it hard? But it is hard, because there are legacy assets. There's all sorts of stuff. It is challenging. Most investors I speak to would divest if they could, but currently they do not have enough places at the right risk and yield to put their money. They have to put it somewhere because they've got to earn interest. They will put it on the stock exchange, and they will track the indices. 15% of the London Stock Exchange is BP. So they invariably invest in it. Some of them are divesting, Norway and so on. But it is challenging. So yes, we need to divest. And Sue will talk about the great divestment campaign in the US. And we do need to. And morally, I've managed to extricate all my money out of my pension funds and put it in an ethical fund with no green. We should all try and do that, but it is actually quite hard when there's not enough other places to put the money. So at the moment, this year, not putting aside the divestment, we've got to massively grow the places to put our money on the green side. Massively grow, to soak up the surplus of capital that's on the planet now is the #1 job, and keep tinkering away at divesting, especially coal. I mean, oil, we're going to live with for a while. It'll go naturally if EVs coming in. But we have to kill coal like a vampire, a stake through the heart of a vampire. That's the job. So that's where you divest this year.
You want to take the last?
Well, I ran the divest campaign at my school at University of Denver, and so that's something that's really personal to me. And it's funny that you mention it because, like, we came from an investment standpoint, and you're like, what about divesting? And we started off with the divest movement, but it was actually more important to focus on, and more impactful, really, when you're talking about divesting $5 million from a small endowment of a school in Denver. That's not going to do much to massive companies, Exxon, BPs of the world, but it will change fundamentally, and it will be felt for the climate solutions that are on the ground. Now it's really up to us to be able to give those solutions where you can guarantee at least a similar type of payback. And I think the transition will come naturally. I could tell you approximately 75% of millennials absolutely care, not just about buying products that don't destroy their future, but absolutely care about where they work and making sure that they're not destroying their future, and of course, the money that they make investing in those companies and making sure that their money is not in those companies that ensure a massive extinction.
Thank you very much. And thank you, participants. It's 5:30, so we are going to close here. We can go on and on. We are all passionate about it. Maybe not as strongly as you are, but we are. We can tell you. Thank you very much.